The 91-year-old veteran was harassed by bikers at a diner. But when he made one phone call, the warm summer sun beat down on Frank Hawkins' weathered face as he eased his old pickup truck into the parking lot of Rosie's Diner. At 91 years old, Frank moved a bit slower these days, but his eyes still held the sharp glint of a man who'd seen more than his fair share of life. As he carefully maneuvered himself out of the driver's seat, the rumble of approaching motorcycles filled the air. 5 gleaming bikes rolled into the lot, their riders clad in leather jackets adorned with patches Frank didn't recognize. The bikers, all younger men with long beards and tattoos, dismounted and swaggered towards the diner's entrance. Frank couldn't help but shake his head slightly. In his day, men carried themselves with more dignity. He straightened his back, adjusted his veteran's cap, and made his way to the diner's door. Just as he reached for the handle, one of the bikers stepped in front of him. "Whoa there, Gramps," the man sneered. "Ain't it past your bedtime?" Frank looked up at the biker, meeting his gaze steadily. "Son, I've been waking up before you were even a twinkle in your daddy's eye. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to get my lunch." The biker's friends chuckled, forming a loose circle around Frank. "Oh, we've got ourselves a tough guy here," another one piped up. "What's the matter, old-timer? Forget to take your meds this morning?" Frank felt his jaw clench, but he kept his cool. He'd faced down worse than these punks in his time. "I'd appreciate it if you boys would step aside and let me pass," he said evenly. The lead biker leaned in close, his breath reeking of cigarettes and cheap beer. "Or what, Grandpa? You gonna call the retirement home on us?" Inside the diner, patrons had begun to notice the commotion outside. Rosie herself, a stout woman in her 60s who'd known Frank for years, was already reaching for the phone behind the counter. Frank stood his ground, his weathered hands clenched at his sides. He'd served his country proudly, fought in wars these boys had only seen in movies. He wasn't about to be pushed around by a bunch of hooligans with more ink than sense. "Last chance, boys," Frank said, his voice low and steady. "Let me pass, or things might get uncomfortable for you." The bikers erupted in laughter. "Oh man," the leader wheezed, wiping a tear from his eye. "This is too good. Hey Spike, you hearing this? The old man thinks he can take us." Spike, a mountain of a man with a shaved head, cracked his knuckles menacingly. "Maybe we ought to teach Gramps here a lesson about respecting his betters." Frank's eyes narrowed. He'd hoped it wouldn't come to this, but these boys clearly needed to learn some manners. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone. The lead biker's eyes widened in mock fear. "Ooh, look out, boys. Grandpa's gonna call for backup." Snatched the phone from Frank's hand, holding it up tauntingly. "Who you gonna call, old-timer? The geriatric squad?" Frank's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath his words. "Son, you're making a big mistake. Give me back my phone and we can all go our separate ways." "Or what?" the biker sneered, dangling the phone just out of Frank's reach. "You gonna bore us to death with stories about the good old days?" Inside the diner, Rosie had finished dialing. "Yes, police? There's a situation at my diner. Some bikers are harassing an elderly customer. Please hurry." Frank's eyes never left the lead biker's face. "I've dealt with bullies like you my whole life, son. In the schoolyard, on the battlefield, and everywhere in between. You think you're tough? You haven't seen tough." Biker's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Big words from a little old man. Why don't you shuffle on home before you break a hip?" Frank's patience was wearing thin. He'd faced down enemy soldiers, survived POW camps, and lived through horrors these boys couldn't imagine. He wasn't about to let a bunch of overgrown delinquents push him around. "Last warning," Frank said, his voice low and dangerous. "Give me my phone and step aside." The lead biker looked at his friends, then back at Frank. Cruel smile spread across his face. "You want your phone, old man? Go fetch." With that, he hurled the device across the parking lot. Frank watched as his phone skittered across the asphalt, coming to rest near a storm drain. His jaw clenched, but he didn't move. He'd been in tougher spots than this. "Ah, what's the matter, Gramps?" one of the other bikers taunted. "Can't bend down to pick it up? Need us to call the nurse?" Frank's eyes blazed with a fire that had never quite gone out, even after all these years. "You boys have no idea who you're messing with. I fought tougher men than you in my sleep." Bikers howled with laughter. "Oh man, this geezer thinks he's some kind of tough guy." The leader wheezed. "Hey Spike, why don't you show Gramps here what real tough looks like?" Spike, the largest of the group, stepped forward, cracking his knuckles menacingly. He towered over Frank, his massive frame blocking out the sun. "Listen here, old-timer. You got two choices. Either you turn around and hobble on home, or we're gonna have to teach you a lesson about respect." Frank didn't flinch. He'd stared down the barrels of enemy guns, endured torture in POW camps, and buried more friends than he cared to remember. These punks didn't scare him one bit. "Son," Frank said, his voice steady, "I've forgotten more about respect than you'll ever know. Now, I'm going to walk into that diner and have my lunch. If you try to stop me, you'll regret it." Spike's meaty hand shot out, grabbing Frank by the front of his shirt. "Big mistake, Gramps," growled. In that moment, something snapped inside Frank. Years of combat training kicked in, muscle memory overriding the aches and pains of old age. With a speed that belied his years, Frank grabbed Spike's wrist, twisted, and in one fluid motion, sent the much larger man flying over his shoulder. Spike hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of him. The other bikers stared in shock, their cocky grins replaced by looks of disbelief. Frank straightened up, adjusting his veteran's cap. "Anyone else want to try their luck?" The lead biker's face contorted with rage. "Get him!" he shouted, and the remaining 4 bikers rushed at Frank. What happened next would be talked about in Rosie's diner for years to come. The 91-year-old veteran moved with a grace that defied his age. He ducked, weaved, and struck with deadly accuracy. One biker caught an elbow to the solar plexus, doubling over in pain. Another received a swift kick to the knee, sending him sprawling. The lead biker, enraged, swung a wild haymaker at Frank's head. The old man ducked under the punch, grabbed the biker's arm, and used his momentum to send him crashing into his friends. In less than a minute, all 5 bikers were on the ground, groaning in pain and disbelief. Frank stood in the middle of them, breathing heavily but unbowed. Inside the diner, the patrons erupted in cheers. Rosie, still on the phone with the police, couldn't believe her eyes. "You won't believe this," she said into the receiver, "but our elderly customer just took down all 5 bikers by himself." Frank walked over to where his phone lay, picked it up, and brushed it off. He looked at the screen, nodded to himself, and then turned back to the bikers, who were slowly getting to their feet. "Now then," Frank said, his voice calm but authoritative, "I believe we have some unfinished business." As Frank faced down the dazed and battered bikers, his mind drifted back to another time, another place. It was 1953, and he was a young soldier serving in Korea. The memory was as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. Frank and his squad were pinned down by enemy fire, trapped in a muddy trench with dwindling ammunition and no hope of immediate rescue. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood. "We're not going to make it, Hawk," Buddy Mike wheezed, clutching a wound in his side. "This is it." Frank refused to give up. He looked at the scared faces of his fellow soldiers, barely more than boys, and knew he had to do something. With a deep breath, he gripped his rifle tighter. "Listen up," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "We didn't come all this way to die in this godforsaken trench. We're getting out of here, all of us." And somehow, against all odds, they did. Frank led a daring charge that caught the enemy by surprise, allowing them to break through the lines and reach safety. It was an act of bravery that earned him the Silver Star and the undying loyalty of his squad. Back in the present, Frank's hand unconsciously touched the Silver Star pin on his veteran's cap. The lessons he'd learned in Korea had stayed with him his entire life. Never give up, never leave a man behind, and always stand up to bullies. Meanwhile, across town, Frank's grandson Tommy was just finishing up his shift at the local VA hospital. At 35, Tommy had followed in his grandfather's footsteps, serving 2 tours in Afghanistan before becoming a nurse to help his fellow veterans. As he hung up his scrubs, Tommy's phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Have you heard from Grandpa today?" "He's not answering his phone." Tommy frowned. It wasn't like his grandfather to ignore calls. Despite his age, Frank was fiercely independent and sharp as a tack. Something must be wrong. "I'll swing by the diner and check on him," Tommy texted back. He knew his grandfather's routines, and Rosie's diner was a regular haunt. As he drove towards the diner, Tommy couldn't help but smile as he thought about his grandfather. Frank had been more than just a grandparent. He'd been a mentor, a friend, and an inspiration. The stories of Frank's wartime heroics had fueled Tommy's own desire to serve his country. But it wasn't just the war stories that Tommy admired. It was the way Frank lived his life every day, with honor, integrity, and an unshakable sense of right and wrong. Even at 91, Frank was always ready to stand up for what he believed in, help those in need, and to face any challenge head-on. Tommy pulled into the diner's parking lot, his concern growing as he saw the crowd gathered outside. And there, in the center of it all, stood his grandfather, facing down a group of tough-looking bikers. For a moment, Tommy was transported back to his childhood, sitting on Frank's knee as the old man regaled him with tales of bravery and camaraderie from the war. "Remember, Tommy," Frank would say, his eyes twinkling, "it's not the size of the dog in the fight. It's the size of the fight in the dog." Looking at his grandfather now, standing tall despite being surrounded by men half his age and twice his size, Tommy realized that Frank had been living by those words his entire life. As Tommy stepped out of his car, ready to rush to his grandfather's aid, paused. There was something in Frank's stance, in the set of his shoulders, that told Tommy this was Frank's fight. And if there was one thing Tommy had learned from his grandfather, it was to trust in the old man's ability to handle himself. So instead of intervening, Tommy hung back, watching with a mixture of concern and pride as his 91-year-old grandfather faced down the group of intimidating bikers. Whatever happened next, Tommy knew one thing for certain. Frank Hawkins was not a man to be underestimated. Frank stood his ground, bone in hand, as the bikers slowly regained their composure. The initial shock of being bested by a 91-year-old man was wearing off, replaced by a simmering anger that threatened to boil over at any moment. The lead biker, nursing a bloody nose, glared at Frank with undisguised hatred. "You're dead, old man," he snarled. "You hear me? Dead." Frank met his gaze steadily. "Son, I've been hearing that threat since before you were born. It hasn't stuck yet." Biker took a menacing step forward, but Spike, still wheezing from his unexpected flight, grabbed his arm. "Boss," he wheezed, "maybe we should just go. This ain't worth it." "Shut up," the leader snapped, yanking his arm free. Turned back to Frank, eyes blazing. "You think you're tough, Gramps? You ain't seen nothing yet. Boys, let's show this fossil what real pain looks like." Bikers spread out, forming a loose circle around Frank. The old veteran's eyes darted from one to another, assessing the threat. He'd managed to surprise them once, but he was under no illusions about his chances against 5 younger, stronger opponents in a prolonged fight. Inside the diner, Rosie was becoming increasingly agitated. "Where are those cops?" she muttered, peering anxiously out the window. She'd known Frank for years, had heard the stories of his wartime heroic. But heroics or not, he was still a 91-year-old man facing down a gang of violent thugs. Outside, Frank's mind raced. He'd faced worse odds before, but he'd been a lot younger then. Still, he wasn't about to back down. These punks needed to learn a lesson about respect, and Frank was just the man to teach it to them. "Last chance, boys," Frank said, his voice calm but firm. "Walk away now, and we can forget this ever happened." The lead biker laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Oh, we ain't forgetting nothing, old-timer. We're gonna make sure you remember this day for the rest of your very short life." Frank nodded, as if coming to a decision. "All right then, you've made your choice." With deliberate slowness, he raised his phone and pressed a single button. The lead biker's eyes widened in mock fear. "Ooh, what's this? All in for an ambulance already? Good thinking, Gramps. You're gonna need it." Frank wasn't calling an ambulance. Phone rang once, twice, and then a gruff voice answered. "Hawkins? That you old warhorse?" "Charlie," Frank said, his eyes never leaving the bikers. "Remember that favor you owe me? I'm to pay up." Bikers exchanged confused glances. Who was this old man talking to? "Where are you?" Charlie's voice crackled through the speaker. "Rosie's diner," Frank replied. "And Charlie? Bring the boys." The lead biker, his curiosity getting the better of him, a step closer. "Who the hell are you talking to, old man?" Frank lowered the phone, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Just calling in some backup, son. You boys might want to reconsider your position. Biker snorted. What? You got some other geriatrics coming to help you out? We ain't scared of no retirement home posse. Frank's smile widened. Oh, I think you might be scared of this particular posse. Before the biker could respond, the roar of approaching motorcycles filled the air. But these weren't just any motorcycle. The deep, thunderous rumble could only come from one type of bike. Harley, and a lot of them. The bikers' heads whipped around as a veritable army of motorcycles poured into the parking lot. These weren't young punks playing at being tough. These were weathered, battle-hardened men, many sporting Vietnam veteran patches alongside their Harley-Davidson logos. At their head, riding a massive black Harley, was a man who looked nearly as old as Frank. His leathery face was creased with years of sun and wind, and a thick white mustache drooped over his stern mouth. The new arrivals formed a circle around Frank and the increasingly nervous-looking bikers. The old man on the black Harley dismounted, his movements stiff but purposeful. "You all right, Hawk?" Called out. Frank nodded, grin spreading across his weathered face. "Never better, Charlie. Just having a little chat with these young fellas about respect." Charlie's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the scene. "These boys giving you trouble?" The lead biker, his earlier bravado rapidly evaporating, held up his hands. "Look, we don't want any trouble. This is just a misunderstanding." Charlie ignored him, his gaze fixed on Frank. "What do you say, Hawk? These punks need a lesson in manners?" Frank considered for a moment, then shook his head. "Nah, I think they're starting to get the picture. Aren't you, boys?" The bikers nodded frantically, their eyes darting between Frank, Charlie, and the sea of leather-clad veterans surrounding them. Charlie grunted, clearly disappointed. "You're getting soft in your old age, Hawk. Back in Nam, we would've." "That was a long time ago, Charlie," Frank cut him off gently. "We're not those men anymore." A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembled veterans. They'd seen enough violence in their lives. They didn't need to add to it now. The lead biker, sensing an opportunity, spoke up. "Listen, we're sorry, okay? We didn't mean any disrespect. We'll just get on our bikes and go." Frank turned to him, his eyes hard. "Not so fast, son. You owe me an apology, and not just to me. To every veteran who ever put on a uniform to protect punks like you." The biker swallowed hard, then nodded. "Right, I'm sorry. To you and to all of you," he said, gesturing to the assembled veterans. "What we did was wrong. It won't happen again." Frank nodded, satisfied. "See that it doesn't. Now get out of here and remember this day the next time you think about disrespecting your elders." The bikers didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled to their motorcycles and roared out of the parking lot, not daring to look back. As the sound of their engines faded into the distance, Charlie clapped Frank on the shoulder. "You did good, Hawk. Though I gotta say, I'm a little disappointed. We didn't get to crack some skulls." Frank chuckled. "The day's still young, Charlie. How about we head inside and I'll buy you boys around? I think Rosie might even have some of that apple pie you like." A cheer went up from the assembled veterans, and they began to file into the diner, clapping Frank on the back as they passed. As Frank turned to follow them, caught sight of Tommy standing by his car, a look of pride and awe on his face. Frank winked at his grandson, then gestured for him to join them inside. It had been quite a day, but as Frank looked around at his old comrades, couldn't help but feel grateful. These were the bonds that had been forged in the heat of battle, tempered by time, and strengthened by shared experiences. These were the men he'd fought alongside, bled with, and mourned with. And even now, all these years later, they still had each other's backs. As the veterans settled into booths and around tables in Rosie's diner, a buzz of excitement filled the air. Rosie herself bustled about, pouring coffee and slicing generous portions of her famous apple pie. Tommy slid into a booth across from his grandfather, his eyes wide with amazement. "Grandpa, that was incredible. How did you, who are all these guys?" Frank chuckled, his eyes twinkling. "Well, Tommy, remember all those stories I used to tell you about the war? The men in those stories, they're not just characters in a book. They're real people, with real lives and real loyalty." Charlie, overhearing the conversation, leaned over from the adjacent booth. "Your grandpa here, he's being modest. Hawk, why don't you tell the boy about Chosen?" Frank's face grew serious. "Charlie, that's ancient history. The boy doesn't need to hear about all that. But Tommy leaned forward eagerly. No, Grandpa, please, I want to know. Frank sighed, then nodded. All right, but remember, this isn't just a story. This really happened. And so, Frank began to tell the tale of the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, one of the most brutal engagements of the Korean War. As he spoke, the diner grew quiet, veterans and civilians alike hanging on his every word. It was December 1950, Frank began, his voice taking on a distant quality. We were surrounded by Chinese forces, outnumbered nearly 10-1. The temperature was 30 below zero. Men were freezing to death in their foxholes. He described the desperate fight for survival, how American forces had to fight their way out of the encirclement, carrying their wounded with them. We made a promise, Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. No one gets left behind. Not then, not ever. As Frank spoke, Tommy began to see his grandfather in a new light. This wasn't just the keenly old man who taught him how to fish and always had a quarter for the ice cream truck. This was a true hero. A man who had faced unimaginable hardships and emerged with his humanity intact. Your grandpa, Charlie interjected. He saved my life during that battle. Carried me on his back for miles when I caught a piece of shrapnel in my leg. Said he wasn't about to let me become a popsicle for the Chinese. Frank waved off the praise. You'd have done the same for me, Charlie. That's what brothers do. Tommy looked around the diner, suddenly understanding the bond that tied these men together. It wasn't just shared experiences or common interests. It was a brotherhood forged in the crucible of war, connection that transcended time and distance. But Grandpa, Tommy said, a thought occurring to him, how did you know they'd all come when you called? I mean, it's been so many years. Frank smiled, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a battered old coin. See this? It's a challenge coin. Every man in this room has one just like it. It's a symbol of our bond, our promise to always have each other's backs. He passed the coin to Tommy, who turned it over in his hands, not marveling at the weight of history it carried. On one side was an engraving of the American flag. On the other, the words Brothers in Arms encircled the dates 1950 to 1953. We made a pact, Frank continued, his eyes scanning the room, meeting the gazes of his old comrade. No matter where we were, no matter how much time had passed, if one of us was in trouble and called for help, we'd be there. No questions asked. Tommy handed the coin back to his grandfather, lump forming in his throat. That's incredible, Grandpa. I had no idea. Frank pocketed the coin, then reached across the table to squeeze Tommy's hand. There's a lot you don't know about me, son. A lot I've never talked about. But maybe it's time I did. And so, as the afternoon wore on, Frank began to share more stories. Not just about the battles and the heroics, but about the quiet moments in between. The friendships formed, the losses mourned, the small acts of kindness that kept hope alive in the darkest of times. The other veterans chimed in too, each adding their own memories and perspectives. Tommy listened, enthralled, as the history he'd only read about in books came alive before his eyes. As the stories flowed, so did the tears, of remembrance, of old griefs finally voiced, joy at reunions long overdue. And through it all, a sense of profound respect and understanding grew between the generations. As the afternoon stretched into evening, the atmosphere in Rosie's diner had transformed. What had started as a tense confrontation had become a celebration of brotherhood, sacrifice, and enduring friendship. Rosie herself, moved by the story she'd overheard, announced that dinner was on the house for all the veterans. A cheer went up, and soon the diner was filled with the clatter of plates and the warm aroma of home-cooked meals. Frank, surrounded by his old comrades and his grandson, felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the coffee in his mug. This, he realized, was what he'd fought for all those years ago. Not just for his country, but for moments like these. For the chance to live in peace, to grow old, pass on his stories to the next generation. As the meal wound down, Charlie stood up, tapping his fork against his glass to get everyone's attention. Fellas, he said, his gruff voice carrying easily over the din, I think it's time we gave our boy Hawk here a proper salute. What do you say? A murmur of agreement rippled through the diner. One by one, the veterans stood, forming a line that stretched from one end of the diner to the other. Frank, realizing what was about to happen, tried to protest. "Now, boys, this isn't necessary." But Charlie was having none of it. "Stow it, Hawk. You've earned this, and then some." With that, Charlie snapped to attention, bringing his hand up in a crisp salute. One by one, the other veterans followed suit, each man standing ramrod straight despite creaking joints and old injuries. Frank, overwhelmed by emotion, slowly rose to his feet. For a moment, he wasn't a 91-year-old man in a small-town diner. He was a young soldier again, standing tall in his uniform, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. With tears in his eyes, Frank returned the salute, his hand steady and sure. Tommy, watching from the sideline, felt a surge of pride so strong it nearly took his breath away. This was his grandfather, a hero in every sense of the word. Not just for what he'd done in war, but for how he'd lived his life every day since. As the salute ended and the veterans retook their seats, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Even Rosie, tough as nails and not given to sentimentality, was dabbing at her eyes with the corner of her apron. Frank, his voice thick with emotion, addressed the room. "You boys," he said, pausing to clear his throat. "You boys are the real heroes. Every damn one of you. What we did back then, it wasn't for glory or medals. It was for each other. For the man next to us in the foxhole, for the families waiting for us back home, for the country we loved." He looked around the room, meeting each man's eyes in turn. "We made it home," he continued. "A lot of good men didn't. But we carried them with us, in our hearts and in our memories, and we've lived our lives in a way that would make them proud." Frank turned to Tommy, placing a hand on his grandson's shoulder. "And now, it's up to the next generation to remember, honor, and to serve in their own way. Not necessarily in war, but in life. To stand up for what's right, protect those who can't protect themselves, to never forget the cost of the freedoms we enjoy." Tommy nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of the legacy being passed on to him. As the evening drew to a close and the veterans began to say their goodbyes, there was a sense that something profound had occurred. Bonds had been renewed, stories had been shared, and a new generation had been given a glimpse into a world they'd only read about in history books. Frank stood at the door of the diner, shaking hands and exchanging hugs with his old comrades as they left. Each man pressed something into Frank's hand as they said goodbye, their own challenge coins, a tangible reminder of the bond they shared. As the last motorcycle roared off into the night, Frank turned to Tommy, peaceful smile on his face. "Well, son," he said, "what do you say we head home? I think your grandmother might be wondering where we've gotten to." Tommy nodded, still processing everything he'd seen and heard. As they walked to the car, he realized that his grandfather, and all the men like him, given him a precious gift. Not just the freedom he enjoyed every day, but a living example of courage, loyalty, and integrity. And as they drove home under the starry sky, Tommy made a silent vow. He would live up to the example set by these brave men. He would remember their sacrifices, honor their memory, and strive every day to be worthy of the legacy they'd left behind. In the days that followed, news of what had transpired at Rosie's diner spread through the town like wildfire. The story of how a 91-year-old veteran had stood up to a gang of bikers, only to be backed up by an army of his old war buddies, became local legend. Frank found himself something of a celebrity. People would stop him on the street to shake his hand, thank him for his service. But for Frank, the real impact of that day was much more personal. He and Tommy began spending more time together. Frank opened up about his experiences in the war, sharing not just the moments of heroism, the fear, the loss, and the difficult decisions he'd had to make. Tommy listened, asking questions and gaining a deeper understanding of the grandfather he thought he'd known so well. One sunny afternoon, about a week after the incident at the diner, Frank and Tommy sat on the porch of the old Hawkins house. Frank held out a small box to his grandson. "I want you to have this, Tommy," said, voice gruff with emotion. Tommy opened the box to find Frank's challenge coin nestled inside. He looked up at his grandfather, eyes wide. "Grandpa, I can't take this." "It's yours." Frank shook his head. "It's time I passed it on. You might not have served in the military, Tommy, but you serve in your own way. The way you care for your patients at the VA, the respect you show to everyone you meet. You embody the values that coin represents." Tommy carefully lifted the coin from the box, feeling its weight in his hand. It was more than just a piece of metal. It was a tangible connection to his grandfather's past, the brotherhood he'd witnessed at the diner. "Thank you, Grandpa," Tommy said softly. "I'll treasure it always." Frank nodded, satisfied. "Just remember, son, that coin isn't just a keepsake. It's a reminder that there are some things worth fighting for. That true strength isn't about muscles or tough talk, but about standing up for what's right, even when you're standing alone." Tommy nodded solemnly, pocketing the coin. "I understand, Grandpa, and I promise I'll always try to live up to what it represents." As they sat there watching the sun set over the town they both called home, Frank felt a sense of peace settle over him. He'd lived a long life, seen more than his share of hardship and loss. But he'd also known deep friendship, unwavering loyalty, and the satisfaction of a life well lived. And now, looking at his grandson, he knew that the values he'd fought for, the ideals he'd upheld, would live on, not just in Tommy, but in all the young people who took the time to listen, to understand, and to honor the sacrifices of those who came before. The incident at the diner might have started with a confrontation, but it had ended with a reaffirmation of everything Frank held dear. It had brought old friends back together, bridged the gap between generations, and reminded everyone of the enduring power of respect, courage, and brotherhood. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, Frank smiled to himself. He might be 91 years old, but he wasn't done yet. There were still stories to tell, lessons to teach, and a legacy to pass on. And as long as there were people willing to listen and learn, the spirit of men like Frank Hawkins would never truly fade away. As the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Frank and Tommy sat in companionable silence. The gentle creaking of the porch swing and the distant chirping of crickets created a peaceful backdrop to their thoughts. Frank glanced at his grandson, noting the way Tommy's fingers absently traced the outline of the challenge coin in his pocket. A sense of contentment washed over the old veteran. He had faced many challenges in his long life, from the battlefields of Korea to the confrontation at Rosie's diner, but perhaps his greatest achievement was sitting right beside him. In Tommy, and in all the young people who took the time to listen and understand, the stories of Frank's generation would live on. The values of courage, loyalty, and respect that had guided him throughout his life would continue to inspire and shape the future. As they finally stood to go inside, Frank placed a hand on Tommy's shoulder. No words were needed. The gesture spoke volumes. The torch had been passed, and Frank knew it was in good hands. The door closed behind them, but the legacy of Frank Hawkins and his brothers in arms would endure. Timeless reminder of the power of standing up for what's right, no matter the odds.